The rain been falling since dawn, a relentless whispering curtain that clung to the quiet village of Little Brackenford and made every sound feel half drowned. Even so, when Mrs. Ada Templeton burst into the vicarage garden screaming that something terrible had happened to the vicar's wife, the village heard her. Doors opened, curtains twitched, and from the modest vicarage's side gate a few villagers hurried toward the commotion with umbrellas raised like defensive shields. Inside the vicarage, however, there was only silence, no echo of footsteps, no hurried explanations, just the grotesquely calm stillness of a crime that made no sense. It was Ada who had found her, Mrs. Emily Rathbone, wife of the widely respected Reverend Jonathan Rathbone. She lay on the rug of her morning room, head turned to the side, eyes half open as though caught in mid-thought. That alone was enough to send Ada into hysterics. The stranger part was the single object placed neatly on the table beside her hand, a child's wooden spinning top painted in bright red and blue, as innocent as a toy from a village fair. But this fair had not come to Little Brackenford for 27 years. Inspector Helena Marsh arrived shortly before noon, her coat dripping with the remnants of the stubborn rain. She was known for her sharpness, not the sort that cut, but the sort that worried at loose ends until the truth slipped free. The villagers greeted her with the mixture of hope and fear that accompanies unexpected tragedy, and she wasted no time entering the vicarage. She paused at the threshold of the morning room, her trained eyes sweeping across the scene like a cold wind. The room was too tidy. A sitting room frozen in a tableau of domestic propriety, lace curtains drawn halfway against the rain, teacups arranged with gentle precision on a small birchwood table, a book open face down as though its reader had merely stepped out for a moment. But the body on the floor shattered that illusion. Emily's fall had been gentle, no signs of violent struggle, no overturned tables or broken vases. Her final breath seemed to have left her with the quiet acceptance of someone expecting nothing more than an ordinary morning, except for the spinning top. Helena approached it with quick, deliberate steps. The toy was old, she could tell from the faded paint and the slight roughness of its edges. She did not touch it, but leaned close enough to examine the thin scratch carved into its side. It formed a narrow crescent, too intentional to be dismissed, yet too faint to hold meaning. A misleading clue, perhaps, or something subtler. "Who found her?" Helena asked. The villagers who had gathered murmured softly as Ada stepped forward, wringing her hands in her apron. "I brought over a basket of preserves," she stammered. "We always meet in the morning." I knocked and heard no answer, so I let myself in through the back. Emily never locks the kitchen door. Never. She always says it makes the house feel too unfriendly. But today... Her voice trailed off. Helena offered a sympathetic nod but pressed on. "Was the room as it is now? Nothing moved? No one entered before you?" "No one," Ada replied. "I swear it. I froze when I saw her. I didn't even step inside." Helena checked the windows next. All were latched from the inside. The door to the corridor was unlocked but bore no signs of forced entry, and nothing was missing. Not the silverware, not the jewelry, not even the tiny carved wooden lamb Emily kept on the mantelpiece as a memento. There was also no sign of poison or injury, no bruises, no marks on the wrists, no discoloration around the lips. Helena sent for the village doctor, Dr. Linton, who confirmed the absence of any obvious cause of death. "It is quite unusual," he admitted, rubbing his spectacles with a cloth. "She was in good health, no known conditions, her heart was steady the last time I listened to it." "A natural death?" Helena asked. Linton hesitated. "Possible. But I would not stake my reputation on it. It feels wrong." Helena's brow furrowed. Wrong was precisely the word. People did not simply collapse beside a toy that should not exist in their home. People did not die without disturbance in rooms sealed against the world. It was almost too clean, too deliberate, yet for what purpose? She searched the rest of the vicarage. In the kitchen she found a tray with the remains of Emily's breakfast, tea gone cold, butter left softening near an untouched scone. In the hallway a scarf lay gently draped over a hook. Upstairs 2 rooms held the faint warmth of a lived-in home, but no secrets. The vicar's study was locked, Reverend Rathbone was away at clergy retreat in Northumberland and was expected back by evening. It was odd that a crime of this nature occurred in his absence. But Helena refused to leap to conclusions. A tidy crime scene sometimes hinted at sophistication, sometimes at familiarity, and sometimes at pure accidental coincidence. But the spinning top, she could not reconcile that piece. She questioned each villager who had gathered outside, but none recognized the toy. That top looks like something from the old fairground, offered Mrs. Collins, a stout woman whose memory was sharp enough to cut. Back when the fair still came through here. My eldest won a similar toy once, years ago now, but they haven't returned in decades. Could someone have kept one? Helena asked. Mrs. Collins frowned. If they did, they've never said. Helena's instincts sharpened. Emily Rathbone was not a woman known for childish trinkets. She was orderly, pragmatic, and deeply involved in village matters. There was nothing in her character to suggest she would keep a toy hidden away, and if she had stumbled upon one, why display it here, in such a precise position, moments before her death? The mystery pressed inward on itself, twisting. Helena paced the morning room again, her boots soft against the rug. She crouched beside the fireplace, running her fingers along the small wooden lamp on the mantel. A faint layer of dust clung to its surface, except along one corner, wiped clean recently. "Did Mrs. Rathbone dust this morning?" she asked Ada. "No," Ada replied. "I cleaned the house myself yesterday afternoon. Emily said she had parish notes to organize." Helena felt a subtle twinge in her mind, a thought forming, not yet solid. Why would Emily touch only the corner of the lamb? What had caught her attention? She lifted the lamb gently, and for the first time Helena noticed the faintest scuff mark on the mantelpiece beneath it. A circular scuff, barely visible. Her eyes widened slightly. She placed the lamb back and aligned it with the mark. It fit perfectly, but the scuff was fresh. Emily had moved it recently. Why? Because something else had been there, something circular, a spinning top, perhaps. But if Emily had discovered the top on her mantel, why would she carry it to the table? More importantly, how had it arrived there at all? Footsteps sounded from the doorway. "Doctor!" Linton re-entered, holding a folded note he had discovered tucked discreetly into Emily's sleeve. "I don't know if this will help," he said, but it was hidden rather carefully. Helena unfolded it with care. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, thin, slanted strokes. The note contained only 3 words, "Not my imagination." Helena's pulse quickened. A clue, a warning, a message from a woman who realized something had gone terribly wrong, and suddenly the spinning top was no longer a random object. It was a silent witness to something Emily feared, something she sensed, something she believed others might dismiss as fancy, but it was real, and someone wanted to keep it unsolved. Helena folded the note carefully, her eyes drifting back to the spinning top. The enigma deepened, shadows gathering around a truth just beyond reach. Whatever had happened to Emily Rathbone, it had not been simple, and certainly not natural. The real investigation had only just begun. Inspector Helena Marsh lingered in the morning room long after Dr. Linton and Ada had stepped aside, her mind whirling around the 3 words scribbled on the note and the faint, almost imperceptible scuff beneath the wooden lamp. Something about the scene struck her as too deliberate, almost theatrical, yet not in the manner of a criminal who wanted to impress, but in the manner of someone sending a message. She glanced again at the spinning top, its painted surface chipped and worn. It seemed insignificant, yet it had commanded attention, a toy out of time, a presence in the room that should have been empty. She wondered if Emily had known the object's significance, or if she had simply recognized the threat it represented before she died. The sound of footsteps drew her gaze to the doorway. Sergeant Mills entered, carrying a folder of initial reports and photographs. His expression was polite but professy. Onal, the usual guardedness of one used to routine investigations. "Inspector, we've accounted for all the rooms, checked locks, questioned the neighbors," he said. "Nothing unusual, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, nothing missing. Dr. Linton confirms no natural cause, The coroner will attend shortly." Helena nodded absently, her attention drawn instead to the window-sill where raindrops traced slow rivulets down the glass. Something about the condensation there, uneven, disturbed, caught her eye. She crouched slightly and traced her gloved finger along the faint smear. It was small, a single smear of what appeared to be damp soot or perhaps soil, leading from the window latch toward the edge of the sill. Her mind ticked over possibilities. Had someone leaned in from outside? Had Emily attempted to close the window herself? Or had this been done after she fell? The smear seemed deliberate, but subtle enough to escape notice. A sign someone had moved cautiously, aware of the room's eyes. Helena rose and moved toward the mantelpiece again. The lamb, the scuff, the positioning of the top, all these small details were like puzzle pieces in a game the others could not yet see. She lifted the top gingerly, examining it under the dim light. The crescent-shaped scratch caught her eye once more. Not just a mark, almost like a miniature engraving, the edges faintly sharpened. Perhaps it had been carved to convey meaning to someone who knew what to look for. She set the top back in its place, glancing toward the small writing desk in the corner. Papers were stacked neatly, but one folded sheet protruded slightly from the pile, catching her attention. Carefully, she extracted it. It was a fragment of Emily's correspondence, an invitation to a parish committee meeting, mundane at first glance, yet the postmark struck her, a neighboring village, not from within Little Brackenford. Someone had delivered a note recently, perhaps a clue about the source of tension Emily had felt. Helena decided it was time to speak with Ada again. Ada had been present at the scene before anyone else, and yet, curiously, her initial hysteria had contained a momentary hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty that Helena had noticed. "Mrs. Templeton," she said gently, "I need to ask you a few more questions. You said you entered through the back because the front door was locked." Ada nodded vigorously. Yes, that's right. I always knock, but this morning, I didn't hear anything." Helena studied her carefully. There was a subtle shift in Ada's posture, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. Small, almost imperceptible signs, but enough to suggest that Ada knew more than she let on, or at the very least, remembered something differently from what she claimed. "Did you touch anything in the room?" Helena asked. "Even by accident?" Ada's hands clutched at her apron. I may have brushed against the corner of the desk. But nothing else. I didn't, I swear." Helena nodded. She didn't doubt Ada was being truthful in the obvious sense, yet the tension in her body betrayed that some detail, however minor, had caught the witness's attention, something she had noticed but dismissed at the time. Helena filed it away mentally. In a room as precise as this, every reaction mattered. Helena turned back to the mantelpiece, eyes narrowing at the lamb once more. The scuff mark beneath it and the slight imbalance of the toy top, together they hinted at a movement or a struggle, subtle, almost imperceptible. She examined the rug, tracing her fingers across the soft fibers. There were faint impressions near the body, not deep, not violent, but directional, as if Emily had shifted slightly, perhaps in a final effort to reveal or conceal something, a detail that might seem irrelevant to ordinary observers. But Helena knew these small movements often carried the key to understanding what had transpired. Her gaze swept the room once more, catching on the open book on the table. Its face-down position suggested hurried use, yet the page edges were remarkably clean. She flipped it gently. On the previous page, a faint smudge of ink marked a half-written note. The words were incomplete. "Must not trust the—" Helena's heart quickened. Emily had sensed a threat, someone whose presence she had observed, or perhaps anticipated, but had never fully articulated. The incomplete thought was a fragment, a frozen warning. Whoever had come into this house, whoever had placed the spinning top, had done so in full awareness that Emily was cautious, perceptive, capable of detecting subtle signals. The perpetrator had chosen to leave a message disguised as a toy, confident it would be misread or ignored by anyone who arrived first. Helena turned her attention to the windows once more, studying the latch, the frame, the faint smear of residue. Outside, the rain blurred the garden into a muted palette of greens and greys. She noticed the soil near the foundation of the house had been disturbed slightly, traces of footsteps but too shallow, too uncertain to belong to a large person. Perhaps someone had crouched, hidden, or paused to adjust something before entering or leaving. It suggested caution, a careful intrusion that sought to remain unnoticed. Combined with the interior evidence, it became increasingly clear Emily's death was not merely the result of an accident or natural cause. It had been observed, perhaps even orchestrated, with a knowledge of human behavior and a keen awareness of the vicarage, his rhythms. Helena moved back to the body, examining Emily's hands. One hand rested limply on the rug, the other curled slightly toward the spinning top. There was an natural precision to the positioning, the kind that indicated thought behind the placement. Not carelessness, not panic, deliberation. Emily's final actions, whether voluntary or imposed, left a faint trail of logic within the chaos, a pattern only a mind attuned to nuance could perceive. Helena traced a finger lightly along the curve of the top, following the crescent scratch, and realized that the arc mirrored the subtle scuff beneath the lamb. It was almost as if someone wanted to replicate a shape, a signal, a marker for someone who would understand its meaning later. Helena straightened, her eyes narrowing. Her first impressions of a random or misleading clue were changing. The spinning top was not incidental, the scuff mark was not incidental. Emily's half-written note and her careful movements were intentional. Each element pointed toward a silent dialogue between Emily and an unknown presence, an enigma she had sensed, perhaps even attempted to manipulate or control in her final moments. She stepped back and surveyed the room as a whole, taking in the open book, the small desk, the carefully arranged teacups, the gentle slope of the rug impressions, the slight disturbance at the windowsill. The village authorities were following routine procedure, labeling the scene as an unexplained death. But Helena could see the first signs of deception, small and layered, as though the room itself had been staged to hide a truth beneath layers of order. Something was being concealed, deliberately, in plain sight. The story Emily had left behind was fragmentary, but Helena was certain it existed. It was waiting to be deciphered, and she was beginning to see the lines that others could not. The inspector's mind raced through possibilities, mapping the room, the clues, the potential witnesses. One thing was clear: this was not a simple tragedy. Someone had observed Emily Rathbow. Someone had communicated with her subtly through objects, notes, and placement, and someone had ensured the scene would bewilder those who arrived after. Helena felt the thrill of the challenge tighten around her like a glove. She would need more than routine investigation. She would need insight, patience, and that rare talent for noticing what others dismissed as inconsequential. And, as the rain continued its relentless whisper against the windows, she knew the first threads of the truth were beginning to emerge from the shadows. The afternoon light had begun to dim, a muted grey seeping through the rain-streaked windows of Little Brackenford's vicarage, when Inspector Helena Marsh decided it was time to widen her circle of inquiry. She needed to speak to those who had interacted with Emily Rathbourne in her final hours, those whose movements could have intersected with the unseen presence she sensed. Outside, the villagers lingered under umbrellas, watching from a distance, their murmurs and furtive glances a chorus of curiosity and fear. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wool and old wood, mingling with the subtle floral scent Emily favored. Helena could feel the tension in the room, the kind that precedes revelations. She knew that the truth was hidden not only in objects but in voices. Her first witness was Mr. Alfred Grayson, the local grocer, who had delivered a basket of fresh bread and fruit that morning. His coat was speckled with rain, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke. "I saw Mrs. Rathbourne through the kitchen window," he said quickly, "just after 7. She seemed fine, singing almost. I'd heard her humming as I laid the basket on the steps." He chuckled awkwardly, but Helena detected an edge of anxiety in the sound. I came back later, just before Ada found her. I didn't see anything unusual. Did anyone else see you?" Helena asked. He hesitated. "No, I mean the postman was about half an hour behind me. Nobody else, I think." Helena filed the detail away. There was nothing inherently suspicious, yet the rapid pace of his account, combined with the unnecessary clarification about the postman, suggested someone who might be overcompensating. She made a mental note to cross-check his timeline with the deliveries logged that morning. Next, she spoke with Ada Templeton again. There was a tremor in Ada's voice now that the initial shock had settled into a more composed fear. "I don't understand how this could happen," Ada said, wringing her hands. "Emily—" She was careful. She wouldn't let anything happen to herself. Helena leaned forward. "Mrs. Templeton, did you notice anyone else in the vicarage? Anyone unusual? Any visitors? Even someone you thought you recognized from a distance?" Ada paused. "There was someone at the gate yesterday evening. I didn't think much of it at the time. A man, tall, wearing a dark coat. He asked if the vicar was home. I said he was away. He nodded and left. That's all." She wrung her hands again, the fingers trembling now. "But he seemed interested in the house. More than a casual visitor should be." Helena's interest sharpened. "Can you describe him in more detail?" Ada shook her head. "No, I only saw him briefly, and I didn't think it mattered. He didn't return this morning, I'm certain of it." Helena sensed the tension in Ada's recollection, a mixture of fear and embarrassment. It was the hesitation, the small gaps in memory, that often revealed more than certainty ever could. The inspector made a note to canvass the village and see if anyone else had noticed a stranger. The next interview was with Dr. Linton. His demeanor had shifted from professional calm to cautious speculation, as if he were weighing his words. "I've known M. Rathbone for years," he said. "A gentle, meticulous woman. I find it difficult to imagine her death as anything other than a shock, but—" He paused, tapping a finger on the table. "There is something peculiar. I examined her thoroughly. No signs of violence. But I did notice faint impressions on her wrists, almost as if she had been holding something, or perhaps resisting the placement of something in her hands. Nothing definitive, just subtle, easily dismissed, but consistent enough to give me pause." Helena leaned forward, studying his expression. "What about the spinning top? Did you notice anything unusual?" Dr. Linton's brow furrowed. "It's curious, yes, too deliberate to be random, and yet so innocent. It could have been overlooked by anyone else." He gave a small, wry smile. Perhaps Emily recognized it for what it was. Perhaps it signified someone she feared or someone she trusted. It's impossible to say. Helena felt a shiver of certainty. Each witness was revealing details in isolation, fragments that did not yet fit together, but her intuition told her that their omissions, their careful wordings, were as important as the facts they volunteered. She had to read not only their statements but their silences. The afternoon stretched on, and she spoke to Reverend Rathbone's housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves, a stern woman with a reputation for discretion. "I didn't see Mrs. Rathbone this morning," she said crisply. "I arrived as usual for my chores, found the house empty. Ada had arrived, I believe, and that was all. But I did notice something odd last night." Helena's eyes flicked to her. "Odd? In what way?" "There was a visitor," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Late evening, very quiet. I caught a glimpse of a man outside the window. I didn't recognize him. He was tall, in a dark coat. He looked intent somehow." She straightened. "I didn't approach him. Art him a traveller passing through." Helena's pulse quickened slightly. 2 witnesses now reported the same stranger. The coincidences began to form a subtle web. Did he leave anything behind? "A note, a parcel?" she asked. Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head. "Nothing. He vanished as quickly as he appeared." Helena filed that away alongside Ada's recollection. There was now a pattern emerging, faint but persistent. A visitor, tall, dark coat, unaccounted for, present at critical times. Yet no one had pursued him. No one had even called the police before now. Was it fear? Politeness? Or had Emily herself allowed the stranger to come and go, seeing him as familiar, perhaps even trusted? The thought made Helena's mind race. Finally she turned to a figure who had been quietly observing throughout the day. A distant relative of the vicar's wife, Miss Beatrice Linton. Young, composed, but with eyes that flickered constantly over the room, noting every item. She spoke softly, almost measured, her words carefully chosen. Emily, she was worried, she said, about something or someone. She didn't say exactly, only that she felt someone was watching, that she couldn't be certain whom to trust. She paused. I thought it was nerves. We all worry sometimes, but now I wonder if she knew more than I did. Helena noticed the subtle tension in Beatrice's hands, folded tightly over one another, knuckles white. Did she mention anyone in particular? Helena asked. Beatrice shook her head. No, but there was a letter she received yesterday afternoon. She didn't show it to anyone. She only whispered that it made her uneasy. Helena's mind clicked into place. A letter, a visitor, a toy left as a signal, a cryptic note. Emily had been aware of a threat. She had sensed it, and her movements, her final acts, had been deliberate attempts to communicate that awareness. Yet no witness could explain fully why she died in such a precise manner. Each account carried subtle contradictions, gaps in memory, hesitation where certainty should have existed. Some seemed too eager to cooperate, others too cautious, all revealed, beneath their words, the quiet presence of hidden motives. Helena felt the pulse of the investigation quicken. The first layer of deception had become visible. She had a sense of the invisible hand manipulating events, of intentions concealed beneath courtesy and routine. Someone had intruded into Emily Rathbourne's life, leaving behind signals for those who understood, while misleading those who did not. The voices she had heard today were not simply recounting facts. They were presenting veils, carefully measured, that obscured as much as they revealed. As the day darkened into early evening, Helena moved back into the morning room, her eyes tracing the positions of the top, the lamb, the open book, the half-finished note. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft now but persistent. She realized that Emily Rathbourne had been engaged in a silent dialogue with someone whose presence haunted the vicarage, an adversary or perhaps a confidant turned threat. The witnesses had offered fragments, some unwilling, some unaware, and through their conflicting statements, Helena began to perceive a lattice of truth, each thread pointing toward motives, methods, and the hidden figure who had shaped the morning's events. And within that lattice lay the key. Helena Marsh understood that if she could untangle the subtle signals from the deliberate misdirections, she could begin to reconstruct the hain of events that had led to Emily Rathbourne's final moments. The voices of deception had spoken. It was now her task to translate them into clarity, to find the shadow that had lingered too long in the quiet vicarage of Little Brackenford. Helena Marsh left the vicarage as dusk settled over Little Brackenford, the rain finally thinning to a drizzle. The village streets glistened under gaslight, reflections trembling across puddles. She needed space to think, to map out the labyrinthine motives she was beginning to discern. Each witness had spoken, yet their words twisted back upon themselves like paths in a maze, truth and falsehood interlaced, shadows obscuring clarity. The puzzle was no longer just the means of Emily Rathbourne's death. It was the tangled web of why it might have occurred. She began with the simplest yet often most revealing thread, the vicar and his household. Reverend Rathbourne, away on retreat, seemed to have the perfect alibi. But absence could conceal motive as much as presence could. Helena knew enough to consider subtle pressures, the vicar's duties, the parish's expectations, and the social currents of the village itself. Emily had been devoted, but her attention had not gone unnoticed. Could someone resent her influence, her moral authority, or her quiet intervention in parish affairs? Helena filed the thought under potential jealousy and territorial resentment, aware that in small villages, the outward calm often masks simmering grudges. Next, there was Ada Templeton. She was frightened, nervous, and deeply loyal to Emily, but Helena had noted her slight hesitation and inconsistencies. Could fear alone mask a hidden ambition? Ada had been responsible for many parish errands and had access to the vicarage before anyone else. If she had noticed or even unwittingly facilitated something unusual, it could point to complicity or mere accident. But why would she obscure a detail so innocuous as a brief encounter, or the arrival of a stranger. The inspector considered that subtle envy or personal rivalry might underlie her behavior, even if unconsciously. Miss Beatrice Linton presented a different sort of puzzle. Young, observant, seemingly innocent, but her calm precision in reporting Emily's unease suggested someone attuned to details others missed. Helena wondered if there was a personal attachment behind the careful monitoring she described. Protective instinct could explain it, but it could also conceal resentment at perceived slights or ambitions unmet. The fragment of information about a letter Emily had received was a key anomaly. What was in that correspondence? Whose hand had delivered it? And why had Emily withheld it? It suggested fear, secrecy, and the potential for a motive rooted in influence or persuasion, perhaps even blackmail. Then there was Alfred Grayson, the grocer. Polite, anxious, perhaps overly eager to clarify his movements. The repetition of detail about timing, the sudden mention of the postman, hinted at a nervousness Helena did not yet understand. Was it guilt, embarrassment, or knowledge of events that had not yet surfaced? His role seemed benign, delivering bread and fruit, passing glimpses of Emily through a window, but in a village as contained as Little Brackenford, a seemingly trivial errand could become a vector for observation, subtle intimidation, or a secret rendezvous. Helena made a note to examine the exact timing and compare it with the arrival of any correspondence or visitors. The mysterious man in the dark coat had been reported by both Ada and Mrs. Hargreaves. His presence alone suggested deliberate planning. Who was he? Was he a relative, an outsider, or someone who moved between the two? Helena began to sketch scenarios in her mind. A clandestine meeting, an attempt to intimidate, an effort to retrieve something from Emily's home. Motive here was layered: fear, secrecy, perhaps blackmail or coercion. Yet the reports suggested he left no trace beyond fleeting impressions, relying on the invisibility granted by careful observation. Helena realized that his role, if central, would connect the seemingly unrelated threads of letter, visitor, and spinning top. But the question remained: why leave the top? What message was Emily responding to? She returned to the letter. Someone had delivered it privately, and Emily had chosen to read it in solitude. The content must have been disturbing enough to elicit caution and partial concealment. Could it have been a threat disguised as correspondence? A warning masked as a routine parish notice? Helena's mind traced the possibilities: blackmail, revelation of secrets, exposure of a personal failing, any of which could motivate a desperate actor to control the situation. Each suspect now took on dual roles, not only as witnesses but as potential agents in a tangled scheme. Greed, too, presented itself as a subtle undercurrent. The vicarage's possessions, while modest, included heirlooms, parcels, and savings. Though Helena did not immediately suspect a robbery, small villages often hid desires in plain sight. A carefully orchestrated death disguised as natural might open opportunities for inheritance, control of household assets, or influence over parish operations. Ada, or even Beatrice, could have calculated a gain, however unlikely it seemed. The inspector catalogued each possible intersection of personal ambition with the unusual circumstances of Emily's death. Helena then mapped fear and revenge. Emily had been perceptive, and someone who had felt threatened or exposed by her observations might act preemptively. She considered past conflicts, disputes over parish governance, and any social tensions. Was there a quarrel over charity distributions, property, or influence within the village network? Each small grievance could amplify in a household where proximity breeds tension and secrets ferment unnoticed. The witnesses' cautious speech, their conflicting impressions of time and visitor presence, suggested that more than one person had something to hide, or feared being implicated inadvertently. The inspector also reviewed the strange alignment of objects in the morning room. The spinning top, the scuff beneath the lamp, the book, the unfinished note, all seemed designed to communicate, to preserve or conceal a secret. Was Emily attempting to protect herself, or to signal someone outside the house? Motive might reside not only in those who acted, but also in those who would interpret the signals. The web of connections began to take shape, fear prompting secrecy, secrecy generating miscommunication, miscommunication hiding intent. Helena felt as though she were walking a tightrope across a canyon of motives, each thread taut and potentially fraying at any moment. She paused to consider Reverend Rathbourne's absence again. Though his presence was not immediate, his influence pervaded the household. Control over parish matters, knowledge of household routines, and authority over Emily's interactions might create indirect motives. Could someone have sought to manipulate Emily in his absence, exploiting the predictable rhythms of the vicarage? Helena imagined a series of interactions choreographed to avoid notice: the delivery of the letter, the brief visit by the stranger, the positioning of objects in the room. Every act, no matter how minor, could carry significance in a sequence designed to provoke or communicate, or even to mislead. Helena realized she must sort through the alibis carefully, reconstruct the timeline minute by minute. Alfred's Dell, Ivory, Ada's discovery, the arrival of Mrs. Hargreaves, the unseen visitor, the timing of the letter, all required precise verification. Each discrepancy, however minor, might illuminate the real motive. She jotted notes, arrival times, reactions, expressions, gestures, and the exact wording of statements. Every shadow of hesitation or overemphasis could point to hidden intent. Finally, she returned mentally to the cryptic message Emily had written, "Not my imagination." Those words, terse but deliberate, suggested Emily had perceived a danger that others underestimated or misunderstood. Fear, yes, but also clarity. She had sensed a pattern, and someone had been manipulating events in response. Helena now understood that motive could not be simple or singular. It was a lattice of human desires, fears, and ambitions, interwoven with opportunity and timing. The puzzle was vast, yet the first connecting threads were forming in her mind. As darkness fell, Helena reviewed the entire day's observations. Each suspect had a potential reason to act: fear, jealousy, ambition, protection, or revenge. No single theory explained everything, yet together they formed a tangled, shifting maze. The inspector's sharp eyes traced connections between objects, notes, and witness statements. Each minor contradiction, each hesitation, each unexplored detail was a doorway to understanding. Slowly, carefully, she began to see the outlines of the web that had ensnared Emily Rathbourne, a web constructed from human frailty, perception, and calculated deception. Somewhere within it, the truth waited, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the mind that could untangle it. Helena felt the thrill of the hunt tighten within her. The motive maze was vast and intricate, but she would find her path. Helena Marsh returned to the vicarage early the following morning, the mist curling around the hedgerows and settling like a thin veil over the village. Overnight, the authorities had convened their own review of the evidence, and already there was talk of closure. Sergeant Mills greeted her at the gate, enthusiasm clear in his expression, and he held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Inspector, we believe we've found a breakthrough," he said, voice tight with pride. The letter Emily received traced it to a Mr. Thomas Carrington, a solicitor from the neighbouring village. He claims he delivered it personally, and that it was misdirected. He admits visiting Mrs. Rathbourne and— Helena raised a hand, restraining his excitement. Slowly, she said, "Let me see it." Inside the vicarage, she carefully examined the letter and its envelope. The postmark matched the village they had expected, the handwriting familiar enough to match Carrington's known style. The content was mundane, detailing some parish-related administrative matter, yet the delivery and secrecy had clearly unnerved Emily. Sergeant Mills had jumped to the conclusion that Carrington's presence, combined with the letter, meant he was either responsible or an accomplice. The authorities were already preparing to present him as the prime suspect, suggesting his admission and his unexplained appearance the previous day sealed the case. Helena read the letter slowly, noting its tone, its neutral wording, and the absence of any threatening language. It was bureaucratic, meticulous, and entirely professional. A simple clerical error could explain the urgency Emily had felt. She looked up at Mills. "You're saying that because Carrington delivered the letter and admitted being at the house. He's the culprit." "Well, it fits," Mills said eagerly. "He was here. The timing is suspicious. Emily was concerned, and now, well, it seems to line up." Helena shook her head slightly. There was a gleam of triumph in the sergeant's eyes, but she could not shake the unease that had settled in her gut. "It's too convenient," she said softly, almost to herself. "The pieces fit, but not naturally. A coincidental visit, a misplaced letter, and suddenly the mystery is solved? Something doesn't sit right." Mills frowned. "You think he's innocent?" Helena studied the letter again. There was nothing in it to suggest motive, nothing to indicate threat, nothing that would justify fear severe enough to provoke. Emily's meticulous movements before her death, the spinning top, the scuff beneath the lamp, the half-written note, all pointed to another layer of tension, unrelated to a solicitor's routine visit. She knew that declaring Carrington guilty would be a false victory, one that might satisfy official protocols but leave the real threat lurking. Helena needed to trace every nuance, every hesitation in witness testimony, and every subtle hint left by Emily herself. She stepped outside, scanning the garden where the soil had been disturbed, examining the faint impressions near the window-sill. The stranger in the dark coat, the hurried movements Emily had made to arrange objects, the deliberate yet subtle marks in the room, all of it suggested a presence no one had accounted for. Helena's instinct was insistent. The true criminal had observed, calculated, and remained hidden. They were patient, waiting for others to misread the situation, trusting that the authorities would accept a convenient explanation. Carrington was cooperative, professional, and clearly unnerved by the implication. Helena noted his nervous glances, the small tremor in his hand as he refolded the letter. He answered questions with precision, yet there was an undercurrent of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to a mere clerical mishap. She filed this under caution, marking him as likely innocent of harm but possibly unwittingly entwined in the chain of events. The authorities, meanwhile, were preparing their report, eager to tie up the case and present a resolution to the village. They did not see what Helena saw, the gaps, the deliberate misdirections, the subtle choreography of fear and signals Emily had left behind. Back in the morning room, she crouched beside the spinning top once more. Its worn surface caught the fading light, the crescent scratch now clearer, almost intentional. Helena traced the curve with her gloved fingertip, feeling the deliberate care in its placement. Emily's actions had not been random. The top had been positioned as a signal, a message meant for someone perceptive enough to interpret it. Not for the authorities, not for the villagers, for a mind attuned to nuance, to small deliberate gestures. And that mind was likely still observing from the shadows, patient, calculating, biding time until the moment seemed right. Helena thought about the web of motives she had begun mapping: fear, jealousy, ambition, secrecy. Each suspect carried a potential reason for involvement, but none could account for the precision Emily had exhibited, nor the strange, almost ritualistic placement of objects. The letter, mundane as it was, provided a convenient focal point, a reason for the authorities to declare victory, but it was a superficial solution, ignoring the deeper signals. She realized that the true criminal had planned for misdirection, counting on routine procedures and human eagerness for closure to obscure their presence. She considered the witnesses again. Ada Templeton, nervous and hesitant; Beatrice Linton, observant but careful in her phrasing; Alfred Grayson, anxious and overly precise; Mrs. Hargreaves, seeing but silent about the stranger. Each had interacted with Emily or the vicarage environment, yet none had full awareness of the underlying orchestration. Helena felt the tension of incomplete truths pressing against the edges of the investigation, each detail threatening to unravel if assumed solved too early. The inspector paced the room, her eyes scanning every surface. The rug's faint impressions, the alignment of the top with the scuff beneath the lamp, the placement of the book and half-finished note, all indicated deliberate arrangement. Emily had been acutely aware of danger, and her final acts had been calculated attempts to signal it. Declaring Carrington the culprit ignored this careful orchestration. Helena could not allow the investigation to be satisfied with appearances. By mid-afternoon, the authorities were preparing a formal statement. Mills was eager, citing the letter and Carrington's admitted presence as sufficient cause for closure. Helena stepped into the vicarage garden, watching the rain-slick paths, her mind tracing invisible lines of movement, timing, and intention. The real criminal had orchestrated events with patience and subtlety. They remained unseen, biding time, confident that routine and coincidence would mask their influence. Helena felt the cold certainty that the danger was not past, that a false sense of victory could lull the village into complacency. She returned to the morning room one last time before leaving, crouching beside the spinning top. The crescent-shaped scratch caught the fading light again, a silent witness to intentions beyond ordinary perception. Helena's sharp eyes traced the room, noting the subtle asymmetry, the slight misalignments, the faint traces of human presence, almost invisible to the untrained. She realized that the breakthrough celebrated by others was incomplete, perhaps even deliberately misleading. The shadow of the true perpetrator loomed large, hidden in plain sight, and the inspector knew that patience and meticulous attention would be the only weapons to draw it out. As the evening settled fully, the village slept under a blanket of rain and mist, unaware that the proclaimed solution was merely a veneer. Helena Marsh left the vicarage with a sense of quiet urgency. The real mystery remained alive, delicate and dangerous, waiting for the right moment to strike again, and she would be ready. The case was far from over. The game had only just begun. Helena Marsh returned to the vicarage the next morning with a quiet determination, her mind restless with the unresolved threads of Emily Rathbourne's death. The rain had ceased, leaving the village shrouded in a damp, lingering mist that gave the hedgerows and cobbled streets an ethereal quality. Inside the morning room, the spinning top lay exactly where she had left it, a small, defiant reminder of the puzzle that refused to be simplified. Helena's eyes swept over the room again, noting the half-finished note, the scuff beneath the lamp, the faint impressions on the rug. Each object seemed to pulse with meaning, yet she felt as though something vital had been overlooked, a detail buried beneath layers of appearances, a whisper from the past waiting to be heard. Her first thought was to revisit the letters and correspondence Emily had received in recent weeks. In the vicarage study she found a small, forgotten bundle tied with faded ribbon. Emily had apparently kept old parish correspondence, charity notices, and invitations carefully stacked. One envelope, tucked behind a larger bundle, caught her attention. It was addressed to Mrs. Rathbourne from a solicitor in a distant town, dated nearly 15 years prior. The handwriting was distinct, formal, yet slightly ornate, a style Helena recognized instantly. She frowned. The same hand, she realized, belonged to none other than Thomas Carrington. It was not just coincidence. Helena examined the old letter closely. It concerned a minor dispute over inheritance, a local family matter that had ended quietly, or so it seemed. Emily's mother's estate had been tangled in legal complications, and the letter suggested a disagreement between relatives that had left some bitterness unresolved. Helena's mind shifted rapidly. Could the letter from yesterday, so recently delivered and seemingly innocuous, have been part of a far older pattern, a chain of influence, resentment, and hidden grievance stretching back more than a decade? She felt a chill. The present-day mystery might have its roots deep in the past, tied to old motives that no one had considered relevant. Helena began tracing connections between those involved. Beatrice Linton, she recalled, was related distantly to Emily's family by marriage. Ada Templeton had been a young woman in the village at the time of the original dispute, her family intertwined socially with both Emily's family and those involved in the inheritance complications, even Alfred. Grayson's family had connections through parish business, small though they seemed, that bound him tangentially to the same network. What Helena now saw was a latticework of relationships, each anchored in events long forgotten, each capable of shaping behaviors, allegiances, and resentments over the years. The vicarage, the letter, the seemingly minor visitors, all of it could be part of a larger echo from the past. She moved carefully through the room, eyes flicking to the objects left in precise arrangement. Emily's last gestures, her notes, the spinning top, they were not just responses to present threats. They were warnings against a history no one had revisited. Helena considered the top again. Perhaps it had been an heirloom, a relic of a long-standing feud, or a symbolic token representing events long buried. Its presence suggested Emily's acute awareness of connections others dismissed. She had understood that the past could intrude into the present, and her final actions were an attempt to preserve knowledge or caution someone who could interpret the signals. Helena made her way to the local records office, seeking documentation from the original dispute. She discovered that the case had involved property in Little Brackenford, a tangled affair of inheritance, contested wills, and minor social scandal. Letters, invoices, and legal notes revealed that Carrington had mediated between family members, ensuring certain assets were distributed quietly. The records mentioned Emily's family as peripheral observers, yet the documents hinted at tensions, misunderstandings, and minor resentments that had persisted quietly over the years. Helena realized these small grievances could have festered, influencing the present in ways subtle but profound. Returning to the vicarage, Helena convened a careful discussion with Sergeant Mills, reviewing the old correspondence, the newly discovered connections, and the evidence of Emily's last movements. "We've been looking at this as a problem confined to a single day," Helena said. "But the threads stretch far deeper. What we considered chance, Carrington's visit, the old letter, may be part of an echo from a long-past dispute. We have to consider that motives here are cumulative, layered, and historical." Mills looked uncertain, struggling to reconcile the notion of ancient grievances with the immediacy of Emily's death. Helena continued, "Each of our witnesses, each person present, is connected, whether directly or tangentially, to events that shaped Emily's family and her social world. Someone has used that knowledge, either consciously or unconsciously, to influence what happened this morning." Helena's attention returned to Ada Templeton, whose nervousness and partial recollections from the prior day now took on new significance. Could she have inherited a grudging resentment, a perception of unfairness, or a protective instinct tied to decades-old incidents? Beatrice Linton's meticulous observation, Alfred Grayson's anxious precision, Carrington's professional history, all were pieces of a pattern extending into the past. Helena realized the crime was not simply about the present. It had been orchestrated using knowledge that could only be acquired through memory, awareness of relationships, and understanding of long-buried conflicts. Back in the morning room, Helena examined Emily's note again, "Not my imagination." The words resonated differently now. Emily had recognized the intrusion of the past into the present, the quiet manipulations, the layered threats. She had sensed that old grievances could manifest in subtle ways, and her careful placement of objects, the spinning top, the scuff beneath the lamp, the book, the incomplete note, was her attempt to communicate that insight to someone she trusted. Helena traced the arc of the crescent scratch on the top, aligning it with the scuff beneath the lamp, and felt the hidden connections crystallize. This was a code of intent, a language built over years of observation, designed to be deciphered by someone who understood the web. Helena revisited her notes on the stranger in the dark coat, the sequence of deliveries, and the timing of each witness's interaction with Emily. She realized that the visitor was not just a recent presence, but a representation of historical tensions, the embodiment of a threat that had existed quietly, invisible for years. Every placement of objects, every hesitant or exaggerated reaction, was a response to that long-standing influence. Emily's death had been precipitated not merely by a present-day incident, but by an accumulation of pressure from unresolved relationships, fear, and knowledge of the past's subtle power. By evening, Helena had constructed a preliminary map of connections: Carrington's professional involvement, Ada's familial associations, Beatrice's social attentiveness, Grayson's indirect proximity, and the unseen visitor as a current manifestation of older enmities. The village itself, peaceful on the surface, had a history of entanglements, and the seemingly simple crime now revealed itself as a layered story of caution, manipulation, and historical consequence. Helena knew that she had identified the lattice of influence, the shadows that shaped motivations and orchestrated the events of the morning. She returned once more to the morning room, the fading light casting elongated shadows across the rug. The spinning top, the lamb, the book, the note, they were markers, anchors in a narrative extending decades, each placed with awareness and intent. Helena felt the tension of recognition. The crime could not be understood solely through present actions, only by tracing the threads of the past, observing the interplay of relationships and long-standing resentments. Could the true nature of Emily Rathbourne's death be approached? As night fell over Little Brackenford, Helena Marsh stood in the silent vicarage, her eyes scanning the room with renewed clarity. The crime was no longer merely an immediate mystery, it was a story of human connections spanning years, woven with secrecy, fear, and long-forgotten grudges. Somewhere, within those shadows, the real perpetrator waited, aware that the inspector was beginning to trace the path from past to present. And Helena, more than ever, knew that understanding the past was essential if she were to illuminate the truth hiding in plain sight. Helena Marsh spent the next morning immersed in meticulous observation, her mind threading together connections from the past with the strange signals Emily Rathbourne had left behind. The village moved slowly around her, ordinary in its routines, yet hiding undercurrents that only heightened the tension in her mind. Helena's previous insights had mapped the broad strokes, long-standing family grievances, subtle resentments, carefully concealed motives, but the crucial detail, the one that would distinguish truth from misdirection, remained elusive. She knew that to penetrate the lattice of deception, she would need something unconventional, a tactic that went beyond simple questioning. Her attention returned to Ada Templeton. She had been cooperative, yet hesitant. Her recollections were fragmentary, almost evasive. Helena decided to employ a subtle psychological test, one that might provoke the unconscious revealing of truth. She asked Ada to recount, not the events themselves, but the emotional impression of the morning. "Think about how the room felt," Helena said softly. "The sounds, the objects, the people you saw. Don't worry about facts or dates, just the sensations, your impressions." Ada hesitated, then nodded, her eyes narrowing as she attempted to recall. As Ada spoke, Helena observed closely. The trembling of her hands, the slight blanching of her face, and the way her gaze flitted repeatedly toward the spinning top, all suggested an underlying connection she had not admitted. Helena allowed her to continue, weaving her questions in a conversational rhythm, letting Ada speak freely but carefully guiding her toward the moment when the visitor in the dark coat had been mentioned. Ada's voice faltered, her speech grew fragmented. Helena noticed a subtle but unmistakable micro-expression, a fleeting tightening around the eyes, the brief biting of the lip, an instinctive avoidance of eye contact. These were tiny cracks in the careful composure Ada maintained in the presence of the authorities. Helena filed them carefully, aware that the subconscious often revealed truths the conscious mind struggled to conceal. Next, Helena turned her attention to Beatrice Linton. She knew that Beatrice prided herself on composure and observation, yet there had been a peculiar restraint in her statements about the letter and Emily's unease. Helena devised a test of subtle provocation. She presented Beatrice with a copy of the letter Emily had received the previous day, carefully observing her reaction. "I've read this," Helena said lightly, "and I wonder how Emily might have perceived it. Some letters can alarm the most cautious of us." "She watch." Ed Beatrice closely. The young woman's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table, and her otherwise serene expression faltered for the barest instant. Helena noted it immediately. Then, without pause, Beatrice composed herself, explaining smoothly that Emily had likely overreacted. The moment of hesitation was brief but significant. It indicated an emotional connection to the letter that extended beyond simple observation. Helena's intuition told her this was more than concern. It was knowledge of underlying tension, a subtle complicity or protective instinct shaped by awareness of past grievances. Helena then decided to focus on the visitor, the elusive figure in the dark coat, whose presence had been acknowledged but remained shrouded in uncertainty. She could not rely solely on direct questioning, so she devised a test of indirect pressure. Returning to the morning room, she invited Ada, Beatrice, and Alfred Grayson, subtly arranging the furniture to replicate the positions Emily had left, including the spinning top and the book. Helena asked them to describe their impressions of the room, what caught their attention, and how they would have reacted if they had entered first. It was during this exercise that Alfred Grayson reacted in an unexpected way. When asked to comment on the placement of the top, he suddenly hesitated, his voice catching. He bent closer to the object, brushing a fingertip over its surface, and muttered something under his breath about recognizing it from somewhere. Helena's eyes narrowed. She asked him directly, "Recognize it from where, Mr. Grayson?" There was a beat of silence, a microsecond of visible internal conflict. Then, with a quick laugh that sounded more nervous than amused, he said, I don't know what I meant." Helena noted the hesitation, the fleeting tension in his shoulders, the subtle avoidance of her gaze. It was clear to her that he had made a connection he was unwilling, or perhaps afraid, to articulate. Helena decided to press further, carefully, without accusation. She asked each participant to place themselves mentally in Emily's position. "Imagine you were arranging the objects to convey something to someone you trusted," she said. "How would you do it?" The room grew silent as the trio considered the question. Ada's hands twitched nervously near her lap. Beatrice's composure remained tight, and Alfred leaned forward, restless. Then Alfred blurted, almost inadvertently, she knew who it was meant for. She always knew. Helena's eyes locked onto him. The statement was sudden, almost careless, yet it revealed a recognition he had been suppressing. This unconventional method, blending psychological suggestion, environmental replication, and careful observation of minute reactions, began to unravel subtle truths. Helena realized that the suspect or observer she was seeking had a familiar connection to these people, likely operating within the village's social fabric, their actions informed by decades of intertwined relationships. The reactions of Ada, Beatrice, and Alfred were not consistent with the behavior of someone entirely ignorant of the underlying tension. Each had subconsciously acknowledged a link to the visitor, to Emily's signals, or to the historical grievances Helena had traced. Helena considered the spinning top again, its crescent-shaped scratch and deliberate placement now taking on layered meaning. She realized it was a test itself, a symbol placed by Emily to gauge reactions, to alert those capable of interpreting subtle signals. Alfred's slip, the micro-expressions of the others, the fleeting hesitation, these were all confirmations that the objects were working as intended. Emily had anticipated the complexity of the social network, understood the roles of each participant, and encoded her warning in gestures and items that could provoke revelation under the right circumstances. The inspector allowed a small smile to cross her face, noting the precision with which Emily had orchestrated the final communication. It was not merely a cry for help, it was a challenge, a puzzle intended to expose the hidden threads of connection and deception. Helena understood that the unconventional approach she had employed, recreating the scene, prompting emotional recall, and observing reactions, was revealing a crack in the carefully constructed facade of normality. A suspect, previously invisible, had begun to show signs of their presence indirectly through the responses of others. Helena ended the session, letting the participants depart one by one, her mind piecing together what had just unfolded. Alfred's recognition of the top, Ada's nervous gestures, Beatrice's momentary lapse in composure, each offered a new insight. The unconventional tactic had worked. It forced subtle truths to the surface, showing Helena which parts of the web were connected to the visitor, to the historical grievances, and to Emily's awareness of danger. She remained alone in the room for a long moment, crouching beside the spinning top, tracing the crescent-shaped scratch. Emily Rathbourne's ingenuity in arranging the room, leaving signals, and anticipating human reactions became strikingly clear. Helena knew that the reactions she had observed were more than mere accident. They were signposts, guiding her toward the shadow still lingering in the village, the one who had orchestrated the day's events while remaining unseen. The real challenge now was to follow the subtle cues, combine them with the historical connections, and identify the person capable of manipulating the threads with such precision. Helena rose, her mind focused, her resolve sharpened. The conventional clue had opened a window, and she was determined to peer through it to the truth lurking just beyond sight. Somewhere, in Little Brackenford, the orchestrator of the morning's tragedy remained hidden, and Helena knew that with careful observation, patience, and ingenuity, the final revelations were within reach. Helena Marsh arrived at the vicarage early the next morning, the mist still clinging to the village like a ghost of yesterday's rain. The morning room was eerily quiet, dust motes drifting through the shafts of light as if suspended in time. She moved toward the spinning top, tracing the crescent-shaped scratch once more, when a chill ran down her spine. Something was off. The top had been shifted slightly, its alignment no longer matching the careful arrangement she had noted the previous day. Helena's eyes swept the room, scanning the note, the book, the lamb figurine, and the rug. Something was missing. The half-finished note, the subtle scuff beneath the lamb, had vanished. Helena's pulse quickened. Someone had entered the room and they had removed or altered a crucial piece of evidence. She crouched, examining the floor for footprints, scuff marks, or signs of disturbance. There were none beyond the faint indentations left by furniture, but the subtle shift of the top told her all she needed. Someone knew its significance, and they had moved deliberately, carefully, avoiding any trace. Sergeant Mills arrived shortly after, eager to report the progress from yesterday. Helena did not waste time on pleasantries. "The note is gone," she said. "The scuff beneath the lamb has been erased. Someone is actively interfering with this investigation." Mills paled, muttering something about outsiders or villagers panicking. Helena shook her head. No, this was calculated. The person responsible knows what Emily left behind and is determined to hide it before we can fully understand it. She retraced her steps from the previous day, reviewing everyone who had been in the vicarage, Ada, Beatrice, Alfred, and even Carrington. Each had reason to be present, but only a few had the awareness to recognize the significance of Emily's signals. Helena felt the weight of urgency pressing down. Time was no longer on her side. Whoever had removed the note had intimate knowledge of the environment, the objects, and Emily's subtle cues. This was someone who moved between observation and action with precision, someone confident that they could erase traces before discovery. Helena's thoughts immediately turned to the historical connections she had uncovered. Could this be a person motivated not by immediate gain but by fear or resentment buried decades ago? The manipulation of evidence was no random act. It was an attempt to preserve secrets long hidden, secrets that had shaped Emily's family, the village, and the network of relationships surrounding the vicarage. Whoever had acted had anticipated the investigation's methods, suggesting they were both clever and intimately familiar with the patterns Helena had begun to uncover. She decided to inspect the rest of the vicarage for other signs of tampering. The study and the corridors revealed subtle but deliberate disturbances. A book pulled slightly from the shelf, a chair shifted, a rug creased differently than before. Each alteration seemed minor in isolation, yet together they painted a picture of methodical interference. Helena noted each irregularity, cataloguing it meticulously. The removal of the note was only the most obvious act. The intruder had manipulated the environment to obscure intentions and mislead anyone attempting to reconstruct the scene. Helena knew she needed to act quickly. She contacted Carrington, who arrived at the vicarage within the hour. "We must secure what remains," Helena said. "The intruder understands the significance of Emily's signals. If we delay, more evidence could vanish." Carrington's expression was one of uneasy comprehension. He had already been implicated in the authorities' premature conclusions, but he now realized the complexity extended far beyond a simple clerical misstep. Helena instructed that the room be temporarily sealed, limiting access to a select few, while she reviewed the placement of objects, the remaining clues, and the witnesses' interactions. She noticed that the spinning top, though shifted, still contained a subtle mark, a crescent faintly etched on its base. Someone had moved it deliberately but had not removed every detail, perhaps assuming the subtlety would escape observation. Helena's keen eyes noted the alignment, the partial preservation of the scratch, and the way the object's orientation suggested that the intruder had been aware of her previous observations. The implications were clear. Someone was watching her investigation closely, acting preemptively to hinder progress. Helena's mind raced through the list of potential suspects. Ada and Beatrice had been present recently, both with intimate knowledge of the vicarage and Emily's routines. Alfred's earlier slip regarding recognition of the top suggested deeper awareness than previously acknowledged. Could one of them have moved the note, erased the scuff, and subtly altered the room to hide their involvement? Or to protect someone else? Helena knew that in cases such as this, interference often indicated personal stakes, a desire to control perception and manipulate the narrative. Helena decided that subtle observation would be key. She would not confront anyone directly yet. The intruder needed to reveal themselves through patterns, mistakes, or emotional reactions. The removal of evidence was a message as much as a cover-up, a calculated act designed to buy time and maintain concealment. Helena's task now was to wait, watch, and provoke a response without arousing suspicion. She reviewed the historical records again, cross-referencing the old inheritance dispute, family ties, and social entanglements with the recent activity in the vicarage. One pattern emerged: every individual with access to Emily, every person capable of interpreting her signals, had overlapping connections to the original grievances. The intruder had exploited these connections, understanding not only the present environment, but the emotional and social history that dictated responses, loyalties, and fears. Helena's resolve hardened. The vanishing note was no mere coincidence. It was a deliberate attempt to shape perception, to divert attention, and to obscure the truth before it could be fully revealed. She knew that conventional methods alone would not suffice. Careful psychological observation, attention to micro-reactions, and subtle manipulation of the environment would be necessary to draw the intruder out by late afternoon. Helena had repositioned the remaining objects in the room to mimic the layout Emily had last established, while noting every shift and alignment for future comparison. The spinning top was angled deliberately to attract attention, the book partially open, the lamp placed at a slight offset from its previous position. Helena considered this her trap, a stage for observation, designed to provoke recognition, hesitation, or inadvertent disclosure. As the shadows lengthened, the village seemed to hold its breath. Helena stood in the middle of the morning room, absorbing the quiet tension. The intruder had acted with precision, but Helena knew that no one could manipulate every detail perfectly. Human instinct, curiosity, and the pressure of observation would create cracks. The vanishing evidence was a warning and an opportunity, a calculated move by someone confident yet vulnerable. Helena's task was now clear: watch, wait, and interpret the subtle signs. The real danger was still present, operating in the margins, shaping events from behind the scenes, but Helena Marsh was ready. She would uncover the truth, and the intruder would reveal themselves, whether by misstep, emotion, or overconfidence. The stakes had risen, and the game had grown more perilous, but Helena's resolve was unwavering. The shadows of deception were narrowing, and she would follow them to their source. Helena Marsh had spent the evening meticulously cataloguing the remaining clues in the morning room, the fading light casting long, wavering shadows across the carefully arranged objects. She was cross-referencing witness statements with the historical records she had unearthed, mentally mapping the complex web of grievances, jealousies, and fears. Just as she leaned back in the worn armchair, a sharp, urgent rap came at the vicarage door. She rose, sensing immediately that the rhythm of the knock carried tension, not civility. Outside stood Sergeant Mills, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm. "Inspector," he gasped, "you need to come quickly. There's been an incident at Beatrice Linton's house." Helena's mind snapped into focus. She grabbed her coat and followed him through the misted streets, the village appearing ghostly under the flickering gaslights. They arrived at Beatrice's modest home within minutes. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges, and a cold draught whispered through the hall. Inside, Helena noted immediately that something was wrong. Signs of Ogle marred the otherwise orderly rooms, chairs overturned, and a small pool of dark liquid glimmered near the study table. Beatrice herself was missing. There was no trace of her in the house, no note, no hint of departure. The room was otherwise empty, save for subtle marks of intrusion. The window latch had been forced just slightly, enough to suggest entry or exit, but no footprints led clearly to or from it. Helena moved carefully, scanning the surfaces for details others might overlook. The spinning top that Beatrice had kept as a memento of her childhood sat in its usual place, yet dust disturbance suggested it had been moved recently, then returned. Helena's mind traced the possible scenarios. This was deliberate, a message designed to unsettle and mislead. "What do you make of it?" Mills asked nervously. Helena's eyes never left the room. "The intruder is confident," she said, "and deliberate. They've struck before we could act, knowing the pattern of our observations. This is not an impulsive act. It is a calculated escalation." She crouched, examining the faint scratches on the wooden floor near the fireplace. They were minor, easily overlooked, but indicative of a heavy object having been dragged across the surface. Someone had taken something, or moved something of importance, and left just enough ambiguity to misdirect. Helena's gut told her it had significance to the unfolding events, tied to Emily's original signals and to the visitor in the dark coat who had so carefully avoided detection until now. The realization struck her cold. The villain was not merely manipulating evidence, they were controlling the pace and direction of the investigation. Each act of interference, each vanishing note, each subtle rearrangement had been designed to buy time, to maintain dominance over the unfolding story. And now, with Beatrice gone, the stakes had shifted dramatically. Helena could no longer focus solely on uncovering the historical motives and observing reactions. She had to prevent further harm. Returning to the morning room in her mind, Helena replayed the previous day's observations. Alfred Grayson's recognition of the spinning top, Ada Templeton's nervous gestures, Beatrice's fleeting lapse in composure. They had all suggested awareness of hidden connections, but none could account for the boldness of a direct action like a disappearance. Helena felt the tension tighten in her chest. Whoever was responsible had escalated, and Helena had only glimpsed their careful orchestration. The challenge was no longer theoretical, it was immediate and potentially lethal. Helena examined the physical evidence at Beatrice's house. The window latch, the scuff marks, and the displaced objects formed a subtle trail. She could not yet determine whether Beatrice had been taken forcefully or had fled in panic, though the signs of struggle suggested resistance. The intruder had planned for misdirection, a rangin. The room to imply ambiguity, yet the subtleties, dust shifts, smudges, faint impressions in the carpet, betrayed a careful mind, one that knew the value of concealment and theatricality. Helena's eyes traced each mark, mapping the invisible hand that had moved through the space. She returned to the notion of the spinning top, which now seemed more than a symbol. It was a pivot in the orchestration, an anchor around which the intruder manipulated perception. Helena realized that the top's positioning at Beatrice's home had been deliberate, intended to provoke recognition, to test whether anyone would notice the subtle discrepancies. Its movement now suggested a signal, a warning, a claim of control, or perhaps an invitation to follow the threads if one were observant enough. Helena felt a shiver of awareness. The villain had not merely acted, they had sent a message, daring the investigator to pursue the path they had set. Helena's mind raced through the potential suspects and their historical entanglements. Ada Templeton had access and nervous tendencies. Alfred Grayson had shown recognition of Emily's coded signals. Carrington had passed ties through the inheritance disputes, yet none of these alone explained the boldness of the current escalation. Helena's instincts told her that the perpetrator was someone who had blended knowledge of the past with acute awareness of the present, someone capable of anticipating her investigative steps. The disappearance of Beatrice, following the vanishing note, demonstrated a level of foresight and planning that marked the intruder as both dangerous and remarkably cunning. Helena resolved that subtle observation would be crucial. She needed to trace behavioral patterns, watch for mistakes, and manipulate the environment to provoke a revealing action. The ordinary measures of questioning and scrutiny would not suffice. She would have anticipate the intruder's psychology, predict reactions, and draw them out through orchestrated scenarios. The disappearance of Beatrice had raised the stakes from solving a mystery to preventing further harm, transforming the investigation into a race against an unseen but highly intelligent adversary. Returning to the vicarage that evening, Helena reviewed the remaining evidence, noting every detail, every alignment, and every previously observed micro-expression. She reconstructed scenarios of movement and timing, overlaying historical grievances with present actions, projecting the likely course of the intruder's next moves. The spinning top, the half-finished note, the shifted scuff beneath the lamb, all became elements of a mental map she traced over and over. She knew that the intruder would respond to subtle cues, that overconfidence or impatience might reveal the next location or the next act of interference. As night settled over Little Brackenford, Helena Marsh felt the tension of imminent confrontation tighten around her. The villain had proven themselves several steps ahead, escalating from vanishing evidence to the abduction or disappearance of a key witness. The investigation was no longer merely about understanding motives or uncovering hidden messages. It was about preventing further tragedy and outmaneuvering a calculating adversary who had mastered the delicate interplay of past grievances and present actions. Helena's resolve crystallized. The trap set by Emily Rathbourne's signals, combined with her own careful orchestration of observation and subtle provocation, would be the means to draw the intruder into the open. But she understood fully that the next act could be perilous, and that each moment wasted might allow the villain to strike again. The game had shifted dramatically, and Helena Marsh knew that the next discovery would be decisive. The shadows of deception were now not only threats to truth, they were threats to life itself. Helena Marsh spent the following morning moving deliberately through the village, retracing the steps of the previous days, reviewing each small, overlooked detail. Her mind circled relentlessly over the vanishing note, the rearranged objects in the vicarage, and Beatrice Linton's disappearance. Every movement, every shift in furniture, every subtle hesitation in her witness's words began to form an intricate lattice in her mind, like a puzzle whose pieces had always existed, but whose full image had eluded her. It was in this meticulous, almost obsessive retracing that the first hints of a pattern began to emerge. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Helena had been reviewing Ada Templeton's statements from the previous day, comparing them against the minor disturbances in Beatrice's home. One phrase kept returning to her, Ada's repeated mention of the tilt of the top. The way she had instinctively glanced at it whenever Helena discussed the room's arrangement. It seemed trivial, almost meaningless at the time, but now it resonated differently. Ada had focused on the object not simply because it was a familiar childhood toy, but because she understood something about its placement, about the alignment and orientation that others overlooked. It was a clue not of guilt, but of awareness, a recognition of a signal deliberately placed by Emily Rathbourne. Helena realized that the spinning top was more than a symbol. It was a node in a network of communications, a deliberate indicator of movement, timing, and attention. Helena returned to the morning room at the vicarage and crouched beside the top once more. The crescent-shaped scratch, the slight tilt, the alignment with the scuff beneath the lamb, all now seemed to form a code of sorts, a silent language Emily had devised to convey danger and guidance simultaneously. Helena's eyes traced the angles and positioning, then extended her attention outward to the other objects, the half-finished note, the displaced book, the subtle marks on the rug. Each had been placed with intention, and each, when viewed collectively, formed a map of awareness. The pattern became even clearer when Helena cross-referenced Alfred Grayson's recognition of the top with Beatrice's disappearance. Alfred had reacted to the object instinctively, revealing a faint but undeniable memory of its significance. Beatrice's absence, Helena realized, was likely a direct response to the same pattern Emily had been leaving, a message meant for those perceptive enough to notice the signals. The intruder, Helena thought grimly, must have been monitoring this chain of recognition, acting swiftly to remove or manipulate anyone capable of following Emily's carefully constructed trail. The pattern was now unmistakable. The objects, the reactions, the disturbances, they were all part of an orchestrated sequence designed to conceal the villain's movements, while exposing those attuned to Emily's cues. Helena pulled out her notebook, sketching the relationships and movements she had traced so far. Each placement, each gesture, each micro-expression from the witnesses now had a logical position in the web. Ada's nervous attention to the top, Beatrice's careful observation, Alfred's inadvertent admission, they were all points along a temporal and spatial sequence dictated by Emily's anticipatory planning. The pieces that had seemed random, the vanishing note, the rearranged objects, the subtle scuffs, were now clearly intentional. Helena realized that the intruder had misjudged how much could be inferred from these signals. They had assumed subtlety would obscure meaning, but it had, instead, revealed the pattern to someone attentive. Her thoughts turned to the visitor in the dark coat, whose presence had shadowed the events from the beginning. The pattern suggested someone who had intimate knowledge of the vicarage, the villagers, and the historical grievances Helena had uncovered. They had moved with precision, anticipating the inspector's methods and intervening to erase or manipulate evidence. Yet the careful orchestration of Emily's signals had left a trail no intruder could fully eliminate without a complete understanding of the underlying logic, an understanding that Helena now possessed. The pattern itself became a form of protection, a map of attention, a way to anticipate the villain's next moves. Helena decided to test the pattern in a controlled way. She recreated the morning room as Emily had last left it, ensuring every object was positioned precisely, noting the angles and spacing. She then invited Ada and Alfred individually, asking them to describe their impressions without prompting Rico. Ignition of the top or the scuff beneath the lamp. Ada's attention immediately returned to the tilt of the top, her eyes narrowing, her voice catching slightly. Alfred, when alone, examined the top, paused, and muttered an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of its crescent mark. Helena observed the micro-expressions, the subtle changes in posture and facial tension, and noted them carefully. The pattern she had recognized was now actively revealing knowledge of both the past and the present to those capable of noticing. It was then that Helena's mind connected another detail. The intruder's manipulations, the vanishing note, Beatrice's disappearance, the rearranged objects, were not random escalations. They followed the same sequence Emily had encoded. Each act corresponded to a step in her anticipatory pattern, a reaction to who had noticed and who had not. The intruder was responding to the pattern, and the pattern itself now allowed Helena to predict the intruder's next move. It was a revelation that brought both relief and tension. She understood the structure, yet the danger remained immediate. Returning to the village streets, Helena reviewed the historical connections and the sequence of events alongside the spatial patterns she had traced. Each family tie, each social interaction, each minor grievance now aligned with the objects and behaviors she had catalogued. The pattern was more than symbolic, it was operational, dictating both the intruder's and the villagers' actions. Helena realized the case had never been about a single act or single individual. It was about a system of knowledge, history, and observation intersecting in a living, responsive sequence. By late evening, Helena Marsh returned to the vicarage, her mind finally settling into clarity. The pieces no longer felt disparate or random. The invisible lattice had emerged into comprehension. Every subtle gesture, every overlooked object, every minor hesitation now had a logical place. The spinning top, the scuff beneath the lamp, the half-finished note, Beatrice's disappearance. All were threads woven into a precise pattern that, if followed correctly, would expose the intruder and the motivations that had guided every step of the unfolding tragedy. Standing in the center of the morning room, Helena traced her gaze over the familiar objects once more. The pattern was now evident, visible in the alignment of the room, the subtle positioning of the top, the reactions she had observed, and the historical web of relationships. The intruder had acted with skill, but they had not anticipated that Emily Rathbourne's careful signals, combined with Helena's meticulous observation, would allow the pattern to emerge. Helena felt a surge of determination. The sequence was clear, the logic of events discernible, and the path forward evident. The shadows of the past and the manipulations of the present could now be traced, step by step, leading her to the orchestrator of the chaos, and ultimately to justice. Helena Marsh finally allowed herself a quiet moment to breathe. The pattern had emerged, and with it the means to anticipate the next move, confront the intruder, and bring the tangled web of history and deception into the light. The game had shifted once more, but now, for the first time, the advantage belonged to her. Helena Marsh spent the night in restless contemplation, the quiet of the vicarage a fragile cloak over the tension coiling in her mind. The pattern had emerged, subtle and precise, yet it had revealed only the movements and reactions, the structure of the events, but not the driving force behind them. She needed to understand the why, the hidden motive that had transformed ordinary grievances and social entanglements into a meticulously orchestrated series of manipulations, vanishings, and threats. Her first step was to confront the historical records again, now with the emergent pattern in mind. The old inheritance dispute, the minor rivalries in the parish, the petty jealousies and resentments, all had contributed to the atmosphere of tension in the village. But Helena sensed something deeper, something beneath even the oldest grudges, a psychological current that had been influencing actions for years. The missing note, the spinning top, the rearranged objects, they were all symbols, signals, and tests, but tests designed to provoke recognition and fear, not just to assert dominance or claim property. Someone had been watching, anticipating, and shaping behavior with almost surgical precision. Her thoughts turned to Alfred Grayson. His earlier slip regarding the recognition of the spinning top had suggested awareness of Emily's signals, but there was more, a lingering tension, a hesitation, and a faint quiver in his expression when he had been asked to consider the objects. Helena revisited each interaction in her mind, noting how his gestures, micro-expressions, and careful avoidance hinted at knowledge and fear intertwined. She also remembered Ada Templeton's nervous reactions, the way her eyes had flicked toward the objects repeatedly, and Beatrice Linton's momentary lapse in composure. None of them acted in isolation. They were all responding to the same invisible hand, but whose hand and why? Helena returned to the morning room, tracing the alignment of the objects with precise care. The spinning top, the book, the scuff beneath the lamb, they were all markers of observation, but also markers of judgment. Emily had created a subtle system that assessed awareness, discernment, and perhaps even moral compass. Helena realized then that the motive behind the intruder's actions was not merely practical or material. The remover, L, of the note, the disappearance of Beatrice, the rearrangements, they were all part of a psychological game designed to exert control, to manipulate perception, and to punish or protect according to knowledge of the signals. It was a chilling thought. Helena reviewed her mental map of interactions, historical grievances, and movements. The intruder had not acted out of greed or revenge alone. They had acted out of obsession. The meticulous orchestration, the precise timing, and the careful manipulation of human responses all pointed to someone driven by a compulsive need to control narrative and behavior. Helena realized that the villain's psychology was central to understanding the crime. They were not content to act in secret. They had to dictate perception, test recognition, and measure responses. Helena's insight deepened when she considered the final act at Beatrice Linton's home. The disappearance, the subtle marks of struggle, the altered positioning of objects, all reflected a desire not merely to remove witnesses, but to provoke fear and self-doubt. The intruder wanted to assert dominance over the investigation, to control the narrative entirely, and to test Helena's capacity to read the signals. This was a mind that thrived on anticipation, manipulation, and the psychological tension of others. Then, Helena remembered the faint inscriptions on the underside of the spinning top, previously dismissed as trivial scratches. In combination with the crescent mark, The faint indentations suggested a personal signature, someone who left markers to communicate without words, to assert presence without direct confrontation. Helena understood now that the intruder had been treating the entire investigation as a form of chess, each piece placed and removed strategically, anticipating responses and adjusting behavior based on outcomes. It was a level of psychological calcula, that spoke of deep obsession, intertwined with personal history and long-standing resentment. The motive, Helena realized, was rooted in fear of exposure, combined with an overpowering need to assert control over a world that had, in the intruder's mind, wronged them or overlooked them. It was not a simple matter of money, property, or social standing. It was about dominance, recognition, and the compulsion to manipulate outcomes and perceptions to conform to a personal sense of order. Emily's signals, meticulously constructed, had challenged this control, and the intruder's escalating actions had been responses to the threat posed by insight, awareness, and moral perception. Helena now examined Alfred Grayson once more, recalling the subtle signs of recognition and hesitation he had exhibited. The pattern suggested that he had intimate knowledge of the historical grievances, the signals Emily had left, and the potential consequences of discovery. Could he be the one whose obsession had driven the escalating series of manipulations, the disappearance, and the vanishing evidence? Helena recalled his meticulous care, his awareness of minute details, and the faint emotional tremor that accompanied recognition of the top. It was consistent with someone whose primary motive was psychological, control over information, over observation, and ultimately over those capable of perceiving the truth. With this realization, Helena began to reconstruct the intruder's thought process. Each act, the vanishing note, the rearrangements, Beatrice's disappearance, was a calculated response to Emily's signals. The intruder had anticipated that Emily's careful encoding of awareness would provoke recognition in others and had responded with a sequence of interventions designed to reassert control. Helena saw the logic of escalation. Each act was not arbitrary, but reactive, a defensive and offensive strategy aimed at maintaining dominance over perception and narrative. Helena's mind returned to the broader social and historical context. The past grievances, the inheritance disputes, and the long-standing entanglements had all been catalysts, but they were not the ultimate motive. The real driving force was the intruder's psychological need to dominate the flow of knowledge, to anticipate, manipulate, and control. Every action, every manipulation of objects, every disappearance had been designed to reinforce that control, to obscure the pattern until the intruder judged it safe to act further. Helena understood the audacity of the planning. The villain had intertwined history, psychology, and environmental manipulation to create a scenario in which perception itself was a weapon. Finally, Helena Marsh felt a grim clarity settle over her. The hidden motive was now visible in its entirety. Obsession, fear, and an overpowering need to control outcomes had driven the intruder to extreme lengths, transforming what might have been minor grievances into a deadly, intricate psychological game. The intruder had been willing to erase evidence, manipulate witnesses, and even abduct a villager to maintain control, because exposure or unpredictability threatened the delicate structure of their dominance. Helena knew that. Understanding this motive was crucial, not merely to solve the case, but to anticipate the intruder's next move and prevent further tragedy. Standing in the center of the morning room, Helena traced her gaze over the remaining objects. Every placement, every subtle shift. The spinning top, the scuff beneath the lamp, the open book, all of it now spoke not only of events but of the mind behind them. The intruder's psychology was exposed, a compulsive need to manipulate, dominate, and control, grounded in fear of discovery and obsessive attentiveness to the reactions of others. Helena knew that with this knowledge, the final confrontation could be anticipated and the orchestration of manipulation could be brought to light. The true motive had been hidden in plain sight, embedded in pattern, psychology, and history. And now that it was revealed, Helena Marsh understood what had to be done to bring the orchestrator into the open, before the shadow claimed another victim. Helena Marsh spent the early hours of the morning preparing meticulously. The vicarage was quiet, the mist still hanging over the village, and every detail of the room was arranged precisely to replicate Emily Rathbourne's original layout. The spinning top, the book, the lamp figurine, even the scuff on the floor, each object was aligned exactly as it had been when the pattern first revealed itself. Helena knew the intruder had been following every subtle cue, observing reactions and manipulating events to maintain control. Now she intended to reverse the roles, to lure the orchestrator into revealing themselves. Alfred Grayson had been the clearest thread in the web of psychological manipulation. His recognition of the spinning top, his nervous gestures, his intimate awareness of the sequence of signals, all pointed to him as the architect of the vanishing evidence and the disappearance of Beatrice Linton. Helena understood that confronting him directly would require a controlled environment, a space where his need to dominate and manipulate could be used against him. Every instinct, every prior observation, had led to this moment. She positioned herself by the fireplace, her posture calm, composed, and deliberately unassuming. A single chair was placed near the table, as if inviting a casual conversation rather than a confrontation. Helena had left the vicarage door slightly ajar, knowing the intruder might attempt to enter under the cover of routine or curiosity. The trap was subtle but precise. The room itself, with its carefully arranged objects, would act as a mirror of past events, provoking recognition and, inevitably, reaction. It did not take long. Footsteps approached the vicarage, careful, hesitant, yet confident. Helena remained seated, eyes fixed on the top. The door opened, and Alfred Grayson stepped inside, scanning the room. His gaze immediately fell on the spinning top, and Helena observed the subtle but unmistakable micro-expression, a flicker of recognition, a tightening around the eyes, a momentary stiffening of the shoulders. He was aware, and that awareness had placed him directly in her psychological trap. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Helena said softly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of certainty. "I trust you slept well?" Alfred's lips twitched, a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. I did," he replied, cautious. He stepped further into the room, moving closer to the table where the objects were arranged. Helena noted the way his eyes flicked from the top to the book, then to the subtle scuff beneath the lamp. Each glance, each hesitation confirmed that he was reconstructing the events in his mind, aware that he was being observed but unable to resist following the cues. Helena leaned slightly forward, her gaze fixed on him. "You've been quite busy, haven't you? The rearrangements, the notes, Beatrice, all deliberate." She allowed a brief pause, letting her words hang, letting the weight of her observations settle in. Alfred's fingers twitched at his side, and he shifted uncomfortably, caught in the moment of exposure. I don't know what you mean," he said finally, his voice tight. He moved closer to the fireplace, as if seeking the comfort of distance or distraction, but Helena's presence and the arrangement of the room held him in place. "You do," Helena said, her voice steady, "and I know why. The pattern, Mr. Grayson, the sequence of actions, the subtle manipulations, they weren't random. You've been controlling the flow of perception, anticipating recognition, responding to signals, and ensuring no one understood the truth before you were ready. All of it points to you, and all of it has a single motive: control. You couldn't allow unpredictability, not from Beatrice, not from Emily, and certainly not from me." Alfred's face paled, and he took a step back, as if the room itself had closed in. I was careful," he said almost in a whisper. "I only acted to maintain order, to prevent chaos. They didn't understand, they couldn't understand." His voice faltered, trailing into the tense silence of the vicarage. Helena rose slowly, moving closer, each step deliberate. "You believed yourself the only one capable of understanding the pattern. But Emily anticipated your moves, Mr. Grayson, and so did I. Every shift of the top, every scuff, every note you thought vanished, it was a test. And you failed to notice the one observer who would see the pattern through to its conclusion." Alfred's breathing grew rapid, and his gaze darted across the room, as if seeking an escape. "I had to." I couldn't let them interfere. Not Beatrice, not anyone. He clenched his fists, pacing briefly, then stopped abruptly near the window. Helena followed, her eyes never leaving him. "And yet, here you are," she said calmly, "exposed by the very pattern you sought to control. You underestimated Emily's foresight and my observation. The trap was never physical, it was psychological. Every hesitation, every slip, every moment of recognition led us here." Alfred's hands shook as he turned to face her fully, the mask of composure finally cracking. "You don't understand. If I hadn't intervened, if they had known too soon—" His voice trailed into desperation, his eyes wide, the obsession that had driven him now visible in its rawest form. "You wanted control," Helena said softly. "Because unpredictability terrifies you. You orchestrated vanishings, manipulations, even abductions to maintain that control. But control over others cannot last when the truth is visible, when the pattern is understood. And now, Mr. Grayson, it is—" For a moment there was silence, the tension in the room taut as a drawn bow. Then Alfred stepped back, the weight of exposure crashing down. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, his voice barely audible, the obsessive rationalizations unraveling in the face of Helena's calm authority. Helena moved closer still, her gaze unwavering. Intent matters little now. The sequence is broken, the pattern revealed, and the harm done cannot be undone. But your understanding of the motive, the psychological design, behind your actions, is why you must face the consequences. She gestured slightly toward the door. "Come peacefully. There is no escape from what you have already revealed." Alfred's shoulders slumped, the final defenses of ego and dominance crumbling. He nodded once, sharply, and let his hands fall to his sides. The air in the vicarage seemed to shift, tension giving way to resolution. Helena signaled Sergeant Mills, who had been waiting discreetly outside, and within moments Alfred Grayson was apprehended, still muttering fragments of justification and fear. Helena took a slow breath, surveying the room. The objects were unchanged, the pattern intact, and yet the threat had ended. The spinning top, the book, the lamb figurine. They had served their silent purpose, revealing not only the orchestrator's presence, but the psychological drive behind every action. Helena understood that the case had not been solved through force or conventional reasoning alone, but through observation, anticipation, and the careful unraveling of the hidden motives and patterns that governed human behavior. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to illuminate Little Brackenford, casting a soft glow over the village. Helena stepped to the window, the mist lifting to reveal familiar streets now imbued with a sense of cautious calm. Justice had been achieved, the pattern revealed, and the hidden motive brought to light. The case was closed not by luck or confession alone, but by the steady, unyielding insight of observation and understanding, the kind that could discern the invisible architecture of a mind driven by obsession and fear. Helena Marsh allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing that the intricate web of history, psychology, and subtle manipulation had finally been unraveled. The village would breathe easier now, and the shadow that had haunted the vicarage and its eye. Inhabitants had been dispelled, yet in her mind she acknowledged a deeper truth. Human behavior, driven by obsession, fear, and desire for control, remained infinitely complex, and the tools of observation, patience, and insight were the only means to navigate its dark labyrinth. The final confrontation had ended, the villain apprehended, and the long, intricate game that had tested perception, cunning, and patience had come to its inevitable conclusion. Helena Marsh had barely allowed herself a moment of relief when a sharp knock at the vicarage door shattered the quiet. Sergeant Mills, who had been coordinating the apprehension of Alfred Grayson, appeared in the doorway, his face ashen, eyes wide with urgency. "Inspector Marsh," he panted, There's been another development. You need to see this immediately." Helena followed him swiftly, the crisp morning air biting at her cheeks. They reached Beatrice Linton's home, which had been quiet since her mysterious disappearance, and she noticed that the front door was once again ajar. Inside, the scene was chaotic. The room had been searched thoroughly, drawers pulled open, cupboards upended, and yet there was no sign of Beatrice herself. Helena's eyes swept the room, noting that the spinning top she had considered crucially static yesterday had been moved, placed deliberately atop a stack of papers on the writing desk. The crescent scratch faced outward, a deliberate signal. Helena's mind raced. She crouched, examining the position of the top relative to the papers beneath. Her intuition told her this was no ordinary mischief or random movement. The sequence, the pattern she had so carefully reconstructed, had been deliberately altered. Someone had intervened after Grayson's apprehension, someone who understood the psychological architecture of the investigation, someone who had watched the final confrontation unfold from a distance. She flipped open the papers beneath the top, her heart tightening as she read the first lines. They were letters, meticulously folded, written in a hand that was unmistakably familiar. Helena's pulse quickened. The words were clever, precise, and manipulative, recounting the events of the investigation as if the author had orchestrated it all from the shadows, praising or mocking each step of the detective's reasoning. And then the realization hit her like a physical blow. The handwriting did not belong to Alfred Grayson. Her mind rewound, replaying interactions, observations, and subtle hints she had collected over the past days. There had been one figure who had always lingered in the periphery, never offering much information yet always present. Carrington, the seemingly concerned friend of the Vicar's family, who had arrived early on the day the investigation began and had lingered near every critical discovery. His words had been cautious, deferential, but always steering conversations just enough to draw focus away from him. Helena had noticed small slips, micro-expressions, fleeting glances, but had never connected them fully. Until now, Carrington had been the one leaving the letters, observing Grayson, Ada, Beatrice, and even Helena herself, manipulating perception, while allowing others to take the blame for the escalating series of manipulations. The subtle shifts, the vanishing note, the disappearance, they had all been designed to look like the work of someone else. Grayson had been clever but reactive, drawn into Carrington's web, just as Helena had anticipated. Helena's gaze snapped to the shadows near the doorway, where the faintest movement suggested someone had been watching. "Carrington," she said, her voice calm yet commanding, "it seems we have more to discuss." From the shadows Carrington emerged, his composure intact, but shh. Subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "Inspector Marsh," he said smoothly, "I suppose you've noticed the letters." "Yes," Helena replied, stepping closer. "And I've noticed that the psychological manipulations, the careful orchestration of vanishings, the removal of evidence, it was all designed to deflect attention from you. You underestimated Emily Rathbourne's signals, but you overestimated your ability to mislead me. The pattern led me directly to you." Carrington's eyes flicked briefly to the spinning top, then back to Helena. There was a slight curl to his lips, an acknowledgement of challenge. "Very perceptive, Inspector. But you must admit it was a delicate game. I had to ensure that no one suspected the true orchestrator. Grayson, Ada, even Beatrice, each played their part unwittingly." Helena moved closer, her gaze unflinching. "You manipulated perception, yes. You relied on the pattern Emily had established, attempting to co-opt it for your own purposes. But the signs were never fully obscured, and your interventions, like Grayson's exposure, proved your own overconfidence." Carrington's expression hardened slightly, but there was a glint of admiration in his eyes. "You have been thorough, Inspector, I will grant you that. But perfection is difficult to achieve when others are involved. Even Grayson's mistakes were part of the orchestration. I needed someone to act, to create the disturbances while I maintained oversight unseen. And yet, you see through it." Helena's voice sharpened, controlled but decisive. "Your control has ended. Your manipulations have been observed, your psychological games traced. The letters, your final attempt to remain hidden, were your undoing. It is not enough to act in shadows. Patterns, once fully observed, reveal the hand that moves them, and your hand is now exposed." Carrington paused, his composure cracking just slig. "Lee, you are remarkably persistent, Inspector. But do you realize what you are accusing me of? There are nuances here, decades of history, family grievances, overlooked injustices. My actions, they were protective, corrective even. I could not allow chaos to claim those I believed would misuse the truth. Helena's eyes did not waver. Protective or controlling, there is a difference. Your corrections have caused vanishings, fear, and nearly led to tragedy. Your judgment has been absolute, but it is not law. The line between foresight and obsession has been crossed, and it has cost lives. That is why you must face the consequences. Carrington's gaze flickered toward the door, then back at the spinning top on the desk, the silent emblem of observation and pattern. For a moment, his facade of control seemed to waver, the first cracks of recognition forming. He had misjudged Helena's capacity to interpret the pattern, to trace the orchestration from signals, objects, and reactions back to him. And now, trapped in the very system he had manipulated, he was confronted by the one observer he could not outmaneuver. Helena stepped closer, each movement deliberate, her calmness a mirror to the tension in the room. There is no further game to play. The manipulation ends here, the orchestrator is exposed, and justice will follow. Carrington's shoulders slumped, the veneer of superiority giving way to reluctant acknowledgement. "Very well, Inspector," he murmured, his voice quiet, carrying both respect and defeat. "You have unraveled the pattern. You see what I have tried to conceal. The truth is yours." Outside, the first light of dawn crept over Little Brackenford, illuminating the vicarage and the surrounding village in a soft glow. Helena Marsh felt the weight of revelation settle fully. The final twist had been unforeseen. The true mastermind had been someone she had scarcely considered at the outset. Yet all the signs had been there for those patient and perceptive enough to trace them. The letters, the objects, the disappearances, the subtle manipulations, they all pointed now unmistakably to Carrington. Helena allowed herself a brief exhale, steadying her thoughts. The case was finally coming to a resolution, not only exposing the obsessive manipulations and psychological games of the villain, but revealing the depth of foresight, control, and audacity that had driven the chaos. She knew the final confrontation had not only tested her observational skills, but her capacity to trace human motives through history, behavior, and intricate patterns of perception. Carrington, now apprehended, was led from the room, glancing back once at the spinning top, as if acknowledging the trap from which he could not escape. Helena watched him go, the shadows of deception lifting from the vicarage. Yet beneath the calm surface, she knew that human psychology, obsession, and the lure of control remained as unpredictable as ever. Even with the mastermind revealed, the lesson endured. The most intricate webs are woven not merely of facts, but of perception, manipulation, and the silent forces that drive human action. The village exhaled quietly with the rising sun. Helena Marsh, standing amid the carefully restored objects of the morning room, understood that every pattern, every signal, every detail had led to this moment. The last-minute twist had shaken the investigation to its core, testing her perception and reasoning to the limit. And now, with Carrington's exposure, the full truth was laid bare, the shadows dispelled, and the intricate, interwoven game of observation, deception, and human psychology brought finally into the light. The village of Little Brackenford had settled into a tense quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows across Cobb, the stones and cottage roofs. Helena Marsh remained at the vicarage, her gaze sweeping over the carefully restored morning room. Every object, every subtle mark, every tiny displacement of Emily Rathbourne's design now lay exposed not only to observation, but to understanding. Alfred Grayson had been apprehended, Carrington revealed as the true orchestrator, yet Helena could feel the lingering resonance of chaos in the air, the faint tension of unfinished threads. She reviewed the sequence of events in her mind. The spinning top with its crescent scratch, the displaced book, the scuff beneath the lamb, the vanishing note, and Beatrice Linton's brief disappearance. Each had been a signal, a trap, a test. Observing the reactions of those involved had been essential, but the final revelation had required seeing through multiple layers of deception. The letters, cunningly crafted, had attempted to misdirect her from Carrington, and the initial focus on Grayson had seemed logical to anyone following the evidence superficially, but Helena had known that perception alone could mislead. Understanding psychology, anticipating motive, and reading pattern were what separated observation from insight. She walked slowly through the room, retracing the steps of those who had entered before her, noting how the top's alignment had served as a silent trigger, the book as a pivot of attention, and the subtle scuff beneath the lamp as a subconscious marker. Each element of Emily Rathbourne's design had been co-opted by Carrington in a desperate attempt to assert control, but Helena had used the same pattern to anticipate his movements and reveal him. She could reconstruct every hesitation, every flicker of recognition, and every subtle micro-expression that had betrayed him, proving beyond doubt that the mastermind had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. The true genius of the design lay in its deceptive simplicity. Carrington had relied on the apparent randomness of objects, the superficial motives of Grayson and others, and the chaos of perception to shield himself. Yet Helena saw through it. The spinning top, angled in a particular way, had not just drawn attention but measured it. The letters, ostensibly innocent, had tested responses. Even Beatrice's brief disappearance had been a psychological gambit, observing who noticed, who reacted, and who was capable of tracing the emergent pattern. Every move had been deliberate, and every move had been countered with equal deliberation. Sergeant Mills entered quietly, carrying a bundle of correspondence that had been recovered from Carrington's residence. Helena accepted it without a word, flipping through the letters with practiced care. The handwriting, the phrasing, and the subtle references all confirmed her conclusion. Carrington had engineered the entire sequence, using others as instruments while he remained ostensibly passive. He had been patient, meticulous, and dangerous, driven not merely by personal grievances but by a compulsion to manipulate perception and control outcomes. Helena paused at a line in one of the letters, a casual remark about how easily misdirection can shield the observant from the truth. Her lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Every move, every manipulation, had been visible to someone trained to see beyond appearances. She reflected on the small details that had been overlooked by nearly everyone, the micro-expressions of Ada Templeton, the nervous glance of Alfred Grayson at the spinning top, the subtle misalignment of the book. To an ordinary observer, these might have seemed trivial, but Helena had recognized them as the silent punctuation of the larger narrative. Yet even as Carrington was taken into custody, Helena felt a faint, unsettling ripple of unease. Justice had been delivered, certainly, the mastermind exposed, the manipulated parties no longer at the mercy of his psychological games, but the human mind, capable of obsession and manipulation, was rarely fully constrained. Helena considered the possibility of accomplices, of lingering intentions, of subtle manipulations that could continue even in the apparent absence of the orchestrator. The letters, the signals, the vanishing evidence, they had been designed for layers, and Helena understood that every layer revealed only so much. She turned to Sergeant Mills, her expression measured. The clues we observed were deliberate, but there were subtleties even Carrington underestimated. The scuff beneath the lamp, the crescent scratch on the spinning top, the sequence of letters, they all formed a pattern that measured perception, awareness, and reaction. Each participant responded, and each response confirmed aspects of the psychological architecture I suspected from the beginning. Mills nodded slowly, though a faint furrow of concern creased his brow. So, in a sense, even with him caught, the pattern still exists. Someone who understands it could continue, Helena said, her voice steady. But patterns alone are inert. They require a mind to interpret them, and Carrington was the mind behind this particular sequence. Yet it is a reminder, human behavior, when driven by obsession or compulsion, can create sequences that are nearly invisible, but never truly undetectable to the patient, observant and analytical. Helena moved back to the center of the room, surveying the arrangement once more. The objects seemed innocuous, almost quaint, yet they had been weapons, tests, and guides. She reflected on the human element, the combination of history, grievance, and psychological drive that had coalesced into this series of events. Justice had been unserved, Carrington was apprehended, Grayson exposed as reactive, and Beatrice safely returned. But the investigation had revealed something deeper, the capacity of a single mind to manipulate, control, and orchestrate events, and the necessity of careful, perceptive observation to uncover truth where appearances deceived. Her eyes fell on the spinning top once more, the subtle crescent scratch glinting in the morning light. It had been the key, both a signal and a test, and Helena understood why it had been ignored by so many. The significance lay not in the object itself, but in the reactions it provoked. She had watched the micro-expressions, interpreted hesitation, and traced movement, ultimately using the intruder's own reliance on the pattern against him. It was a final affirmation of the principle she had followed throughout the investigation: attention to detail, insight into human psychology, and the anticipation of motive were the tools that revealed truth, even amidst deliberate obfuscation. As the vicarage settled into quiet once more, Helena felt a mixture of satisfaction and vigilance. Justice had been served, but the subtle, intricate nature of human manipulation had been laid bare. The case would enter village lore not merely as a solved mystery, but as a testament to observation, intellect, and the dangers of unchecked compulsion. Helena knew that the patterns she had observed, the psychological architecture she had unraveled, and the insights she had applied could serve as a safeguard in the future, should similar webs arise, and yet in the back of her mind, Helena remained alert. The human mind was capable of extraordinary subtlety, and the shadows of obsession, manipulation, and cunning never fully disappeared. For now, the orchestrator had been apprehended, the manipulated parties freed, and the truth revealed. But Helena Marsh understood, as she always did, that vigilance, perception, and insight must remain constant companions. The game was over, for the moment, but the potential for new patterns, new manipulations, and new challenges would always exist. Helena Marsh allowed herself a final measured breath. The village exhaled with the rising sun, the vicarage bathed in light, and the objects in the morning room lay exactly as they had been designed, silent witnesses to the intricate dance of psychology, observation, and justice that had brought the case to its conclusion. And as she stepped from the room, Helena knew with certainty that truth, though sometimes obscured, would always be revealed to the patient, perceptive, and unwavering eye. Helena Marsh stepped out of the vicarage into the crisp morning air, the village bathed in pale sunlight that softened the edges of rooftops and cobblestones. The apprehension of Carrington and the exposure of Alfred Grayson had brought resolution, yet Helena could not shake the feeling that the case had left a subtle echo, a faint ripple in the otherwise still waters of Little Brackenford. She walked along the narrow lane leading away from the vicarage, her mind tracing every sequence of events once more, passing each interaction and examining every object, every signal, every hidden motive. Even as the village seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, Helena's eyes kept returning to a small detail she had dismissed in the whirlwind of revelation, the final position of the spinning top. Though its placement had contributed to Carrington's exposure, there was something about the faint crescent scratch, the way the top teetered almost imperceptibly toward the book's edge, that suggested intent beyond what she had uncovered. It had been a subtle signal, perhaps, designed not only to manipulate, but to communicate. Helena pondered whether it had been a message left deli, berately to linger for someone perceptive enough to notice, a final test embedded in the aftermath of chaos. She paused at the edge of the lane, gazing back at the vicarage. The shadows of the morning room stretched long across the windows, the objects within, now inert yet heavy with silent testimony. Helena's hand instinctively brushed against the pocket where she had tucked the recovered letters. Even after reading them all, she sensed that a line, a phrase, or a reference had escaped her notice, a subtle cue hinting at motives, connections, or actions that might extend beyond Carrington's direct orchestration. The letters had been meticulous, carefully written to misdirect and illuminate simultaneously, and Helena wondered whether one final layer remained hidden beneath their apparent clarity. As she moved through the village, she passed familiar faces, neighbors, friends, villagers who had been caught in the ripple of events. Their expressions held relief, gratitude, even admiration, yet Helena detected traces of lingering concern in their eyes, small questions, unspoken doubts, whispered anxieties about what had occurred and what might yet come to light. For all that had been revealed, the nature of Carrington's manipulations, his subtle interventions, the orchestrations of perception and response, had been so intricate that she suspected there could be consequences yet unseen, small fractures in relationships, lingering fears and unspoken secrets. Her thoughts returned again to Beatrice Linton. Though safe, she had been part of a complex psychological landscape, observed, tested, and almost used as a pawn in the grand manipulations. Helena could not help but wonder whether Beatrice herself had noticed patterns that remained hidden from the authorities, subtle irregularities in behavior, shifts in environment, or coded signals that only a keen observer might decode. Helena's gaze drifted toward the horizon, imagining Beatrice, Alfred Grayson, and even Carrington from their cells, each processing events, each capable of subtle influence, even in containment. The case, though formally closed, left Helena with a nagging sense of incompletion, a whisper of unfinished business. Justice had been served, certainly, yet she understood that human motives were rarely singular or absolute. Layers of history, resentment, fear, and obsession intertwined in ways that could not always be resolved by apprehension alone. There were always lingering questions, minor inconsistencies in witness statements she had yet to fully analyze, faint traces of manipulation in letters she had skimmed too quickly, and the ever-present possibility that someone else, inspired or emboldened by the shadows of Carrington's orchestration, might act next. As she passed the village green, Helena noticed a small envelope tucked beneath a garden gate. It was sealed simply, without markings or name, yet she felt the familiar tension of curiosity and anticipation. She picked it up and held it carefully, noting the handwriting, unfamiliar, precise, and deliberate. Without opening it, she sensed that this was not a coincidence. The envelope, like the spinning top, might be a signal, an invitation, or a warning, a subtle indication that the web of human behavior and manipulation extended further than the resolution she had achieved. Helena's mind raced with possibilities, another observer, another orchestrator, a new layer of motive or insight waiting to be discovered. Continuing her walk, Helena reflected on the intricate dance of observation, psychology, and pattern recognition that had defined the entire investigation. Every detail, from the crescent scratch on the spinning top to the subtle letters, had been a test of perception. The orchestrator had assumed control, aided perception, and attempted to guide actions, yet Helena had traced the threads, reconstructed the psychological architecture, and anticipated moves in a way that had brought the hidden motives to light. And yet the envelope in her hand reminded her that mastery over observation was never absolute. There were always unknowns, variables, and human factors that could defy expectation. She paused at the edge of the village, the countryside, stretching into soft morning mist. The letter in her hand, the memories of the pattern, the careful orchestration of events, they all reminded her that mystery was rarely ever truly finished. Human behavior, with its compounding motives and complex networks of perception, always left room for ambiguity, for subtle signals to be interpreted or misinterpreted, for new patterns to emerge in unexpected ways. Helena understood that her role as an observer, a detective, and a guardian of order was ongoing. The resolution of Carrington's actions did not end the vigilance required. It was merely one chapter in a continuum of observation, insight, and anticipation. The village below was beginning to stir, children laughing, the baker opening his shop, and the vicar stepping onto the steps of his house with an expression of cautious relief. Helena allowed herself a measured smile, acknowledging the closure of immediate danger while simultaneously attuning herself to the subtle cues of ongoing life. She had solved the mystery before her, exposed the hidden motives, and restored a sense of equilibrium. Yet she knew that the landscape of human behavior and manipulation would always offer new challenges. She opened the envelope carefully, her eyes scanning the words inside. It contained only a brief note, elegantly phrased, cryptic yet deliberate. Patterns are never truly gone. Observation is everything. Helena's pulse quickened, even as the Say had concluded. Someone else, or perhaps even Carrington himself in some indirect way, had left a final reminder of the subtle power of perception, of the ever-present capacity for manipulation, and of the endless complexity of human motives. Helena folded the note slowly and tucked it into her coat, her mind already alert, already calculating. The case had ended, but the lessons lingered. Vigilance, observation, and insight were never truly complete. They were instruments to be maintained, honed, and applied again. For the world was filled with subtle patterns, hidden motives, and cryptic signals waiting to be deciphered. As she walked down the lane, leaving the village behind for the moment, Helena Marsh felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Justice had been delivered, Carrington and Grayson accounted for, the web unraveled, but the mystery, as always, had left a faint pulse of enigma behind, a lingering signal in the world that the vigilant eye must never ignore. The path ahead was open, the next challenge unseen, and the game of perception and insight continued, eternal, subtle, and compelling. And with that, Helena Marsh disappeared into the rising sun, leaving little Brackenford bathed in light, but never entirely free from shadows, for the nature of mystery was such that even endings were never truly final.